Hello, this is episode 8 of the Martial Podcast. I'm Mark Jacobs, a martial artist, martial arts journalist, author of the book The Principles of Unarmed Combat, and I tell stories about martial arts. So, our guest today is doing what I think is some of the most interesting work in martial arts right now. Mahipal Lunia has traveled the globe researching obscure martial arts, not just as a practitioner, but from an historical and anthropological perspective, looking at the differences and commonalities for how people fight all over the world. Mahipal, how are you?
Doing great, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Never thought we'd be having a conversation. I remember growing up reading your stuff, and here we are. So great to be here.
Growing up reading my stuff, I'm not that old.
No, no, but you know what I mean. I still think I'm growing up. I refuse to believe I've grown up.
Anyway, thank you for coming on. First off, can you talk a little bit about how you originally got started in martial arts and what martial arts you trained in?
Sure, the usual stuff. Growing up in India, with your parents. My dad was a championship wrestler and won multiple medals in what is called Kushti, and I was a weak kid. I didn't have what it takes, at least, to follow his path of Pehlwani and Kushti, and
Mhm.
I would go with him right from the time I was a little kid. However, the first formal teacher outside of that started the usual way: YMCA, karate, this, that. My parents got fed up with me being a little weakly and getting my ass handed to me, so to speak, being bullied, and suddenly, you start training and you start discovering resources of power you didn't know you had, and you start forming deep relationships with your teachers and friends, and that is that. Never looked back.
Did you get into the Kushti wrestling at some point?
I did. I
Yeah.
just sucked.
Uh,
Yeah.
I don't know if most people realize that India has this phenomenal wrestling tradition. You know, at one point, about 100, a little over 100 years ago, all the best wrestlers in the world came from India, Pakistan, that region, right?
Yeah, and I would say they still have the best wrestlers in the world, but there is no means for them to get on a world stage and compete. And the only competition that's allowed is a very Greco-Roman style of wrestling, and even the so-called freestyle wrestling, which is
Mhm.
very Western oriented and not necessarily adheres to how they practice and how they learn and how they do things. So it's kind of like trying to judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree.
Right.
Um, quite frankly, I think my opinion, that whole Northwest Indian region and old Indian subcontinent, which includes Pakistan, Afghanistan, um, India, the northern part of India, has some of the strongest, if not the strongest wrestlers in the world.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you see in recent years from catch wrestling, people that do that sort of submission wrestling, Western submission wrestling, a lot of that was influenced by a lot of the Indian wrestling. I know some of the famous old-time catch wrestlers like Karl Gotch supposedly trained with Indian wrestlers.
Yeah, and Indian wrestling is a very small term to use because even within that you have extremes such as say bandesh, which is you're wrestling with somebody who has a weapon but you don't have a weapon,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
And we're talking about live weapons and how you overcome them on one extreme, and on the second extreme you have something like Vajramushti. So think about sharp knuckle dusters that
Right.
you and your opponent have, and now it's all you
Is
go at
that
it.
Yeah, I've read about that for years. For people that don't know, it's sort of like MMA with brass knuckles that was being done hundreds of years ago in India. And even into recent years, there's a handful of people that were doing it. Are they still doing it? I see demonstrations of it at a
Yes. So
festival
I
every
know, I
year.
know, I know there are a few guys, especially in Europe and Australia, who love to say, "Oh, it's a dead tradition," and they learned with the last master.
Hmm.
Bullshit. Okay. Two royal houses, the royal house of Gwalior and the royal house of Mysore, still keep complete stables of Vajramushti fighters. Okay. And, most normal martial artists would not have access to a royal house, right? So it's much easier to say, oh, yeah, it's dead. It doesn't exist. And I learned to the last master. So no, it's a living tradition. So the thing you have to understand about India is like like what see a lot of us here in the West, when we hear code arts, we say, "Oh my God, that's ancient. It's amazing. It's great. Blah blah blah." We're talking about 15th century.
Mhm.
That's yesterday in India. Okay, that's yesterday.
Yeah,
You have to understand how people think about time. I myself am a keeper of an 8th century tradition. I have the original palm scripts from the 8th century. Okay, and
which tradition is that?
it's a tradition of Shastra Vidya,
Hmm.
a study of weapons,
Hmm.
one of the systems within it, right? And then there are people with much older traditions than mine that still exist. Now,
Hmm.
access to it is very limited for many reasons, right? It was generally taught within blood. Second, you have to understand the history of India to understand that from the 12th century AD, there's been continuous foreign invasions. First, the Islamic rulers from the Middle East, then the Turkish rulers, then you had the Portuguese, and then you had, of course, the British. And the British wreaked havoc. They passed the Arms Act. All arms were banned. Traditional akhadas or schools were closed down. So the traditions that survived in three places. One is it survived in royal houses within the old Gurukul system. So royal blood connected with royalty, you'd learn it. Second, it survived in remote villages. It
Hmm.
survived in remote villages where people couldn't reach it, right? And so these guys continued doing what they were doing. Third, it survived in urban areas in secret. So So given the fact that there's a almost 800, 900-year history of your weapons being taken away by foreigners, you can't trust them and it would be used against you. They're reluctant to share it. Even
Hmm.
very well-renowned masters, right? You ask them, hey, can I? They'll be like, no, I don't know much. I don't know anything. I just read a book or two. And that's how you'll be brushed aside. So you have to it has to be more than just a formal introduction. They have to really like you and be able to trust you for them
Hmm.
to begin to share with them. See, the thing also is like even present day India, you can't own a sword. So for you to say that I'm gonna go learn a sword art in India, you're gonna land your teacher in trouble.
Hmm.
So it is still a very, very secretive tradition.
You do see some traditions in India and also other places. I've seen this where some of the things that were supposedly secret are being taught openly, like Kalari Payatu. But my impression is a lot of these arts, I've heard this about Krabi Krabang in Thailand, that what gets taught publicly a lot of times is a modernized version of the traditional arts. Is that true, or have you found that to be true in India and other places that you've done
Yes,
research? Yeah.
yes. So like even with cutlery, right? What you see as cutlery today came into being in 1959,
Hmm.
where they started to say, hey, we got to remove all the old stuff. That old
Hmm.
stuff, there's no room in modern society for that, right? And what you started to see was this modern emphasis on a performance art. So, if you will, it's like comparing, say, Haka Kung Fu with Wushu,
Hmm.
right? So there's a lot more athleticism in Wushu as you see in Kalari. And
Hmm.
you have Wushu practitioners say, oh, ancestors have done this since Bodhidharma. Yes and no. You can connect anything to anything. I can connect my martial art to the Neanderthals. That doesn't make it the
Yeah.
oldest, right?
Right.
So, so I would say that yes, you see, I think the piece that you see worldwide is Kalari, but you'll notice one very interesting thing. Most of the Kalari teachers will also be doing some form of yoga or Ayurveda, which
Hmm.
is healing, right? And mainly focused on enlightenment, this and that. Or you're going to see them doing dance. So
Hmm.
you see this emphasis has been much more on this, if to use Don Drager's word, the movement from Bujitsu to Budo, right?
Hmm.
on this personal development and growth and self-expression, rather than, hey, can I actually go to war with this? And I'm not shit talking about any art, but it's a natural progression that you see, even with the whole idea of socialization of arts, right? In the old days, stick fighting was serious business. Then sport competition comes in, and then self-expression comes in, just for it to be acceptable by masses. And that aspect of socialization removes the fangs from the arts.
Yeah. I think it's also kind of difficult to determine what is a traditional art at this point because the world has become so small. Everybody, even if you're in a small village in some remote country somewhere, you've seen Kung Fu, you've seen karate, you've seen Bruce Lee movies, and you've seen the UFC probably. And that stuff has to start creeping into the practice of what everybody has done over the recent years, wouldn't you say?
Yes and no. So I think, so let me answer that, right? I think it's a great question. So yes, it is, the stuff creeps in, right?
Hmm.
Usually it creeps in if the purpose is self-defense or the purpose is competition.
Hmm.
But I would say that some traditions and traditional arts still survive, including in India, where what I call the psychic centers are very oriented towards it. So essentially, your ontology, your epistemology, and your theology driving the movements, rather than just physical skill driving the movement, right?
Hmm.
So when your definition of who you are, how you know what is to be true, and what is the spiritual basis, the teleology, the pull, if you will, right,
Hmm.
that drives you, keeps it traditional. So even within, say, Shastra Vidya, there are many things which, from a modern sense, make no sense, but it's a way of accessing energies, for the lack of a better word, which are far older than time itself, so to
Hmm.
speak. And I've seen this to be true in New Zealand, in parts of Philippines. Some of my friends that have done original research in Papua New Guinea and other places, right?
Hmm.
So when your fighting emerges from that psychic center,
Hmm.
right? There is no system, but there is a greater order, right? But when your system originates only in the body and you're just learning how the body moves, and I need to win, this body needs to win, this body needs to win, then a lot of the creeping happens, and
Right.
then the idea of tradition dies.
I guess that gets into that whole fundamental debate of, is martial arts about fighting, or is it about being an art, a self-discipline, or is it a combination of all of those? Where do you fall on that?
Okay, let's see. So where I fall on that, it's like I'm still a work in progress. So when we think about martial art, right, it means military art. Now,
Yeah.
um, unless you have been in the military and actually seen action, I don't think there's art emerging from it.
Yeah.
Because art is a very personal expression,
Hmm.
right? You could be trained as a fighter, being even in military, but until it hasn't become yours and your personal style comes in, I don't think an art exists,
Yeah,
right?
I'm not sure I've ever seen a whole lot of overlap between something that's supposedly purely for combat and something that's, an artistic form. I think people try to graft one onto the other, and sometimes I guess you can merge them, but really they would
So
seem to be two largely separate realms to me.
correct. So I think usually is, but when we use the word art, it's much more a personal style. For
Yeah.
example, let's say you have a bad shoulder
Hmm.
and you learn to move your sword or your gun in a very particular way because of the degrees of freedom and degrees of movement that have been taken away from you. So you develop shortcuts, you develop a personal way of still
Yeah.
overcoming the particular obstacles. So for me, that is art form,
Yeah.
right? But looking pretty, that's a different story.
Yeah.
So from my perspective, uh, um, martial arts is those who've seen action, and then there are fighting systems that you study. Anyone who's preparing to actually going to war, um, and then you have competitive fighting, which I don't consider uh, martial arts. Then you have self-defense,
Hmm.
and they are different pieces. And then finally, you have what I call, or what's generally called Budo. In other words, hey, this is my way of doing a moving yoga for my
Hmm. Right.
spirituality, right? So I think people generally, a lot of us, me included, just sometimes to get an idea across, I just say, oh yeah, I
Right.
do martial arts. But
Now,
but if I get technical with it, no, it's not the same.
now you've done a lot of research into all these topics as far as the history and anthropology of martial arts go. When did you become interested in researching martial arts more than just as a practitioner from an historical or anthropological perspective?
To be honest, I think always I was interested in that, right?
Hmm.
Grew up, when you grow up Indian and you grew up in India, you're always hearing about the great epics. You're hearing about the stories of bravery. You're hearing about
Hmm.
this and that. So you at least some of us are always drawn to the history and how did it start? What did it start? And so that was always a thread that drove me.
Hmm.
And then, early growing up as a teenager, reading Don Drager's books, Robert W. Smith's books. And at the same time, it was the same time that the whole Star Wars series and Indiana Jones had started to come out, right?
Hmm.
So this idea of going into the unknown, into something very foreign and learning about it and learning about the fighting and just getting geeking out kind of intertwined. I won't say it was like a conscious decision that this
Yeah.
is what I'm going to do, right? It just intertwined into this weird, crazy mix. And then one day I wake up, lo, apparently this is what I am. You know, I wish, I wish, uh, I wish I could say no, 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 this was planned and it started this day and that day,
Yeah.
but no, that would be bullshit. It just happened. I just happened into it.
Now you essentially do hopology, which is basically the study of fighting, of how human beings fight, the culture of combat, right?
Yes. I mean, that's the umbrella that my obsessions must fall into.
Right. That's a
Yeah.
term that I think was coined back in the 19th century by Europeans researching swordsmanship, and in more recent times, it was kind of popularized as an academic pursuit among martial artists by Don.
Yeah, I think Richard
Right.
Burton, Sir Richard Burton coined the term first,
Right.
and then it went into obscurity, and then Donald Drager kind of revived it and
Right.
started to bring it into academia.
Right. And Don
And
Drager, for people who don't know, is a highly regarded judoka and practitioner of traditional Japanese weapons arts who opened up a lot of Japanese martial arts to foreigners, Westerners in the 1950s, 1960s, and then began researching Japanese martial arts history and also the history of other martial arts around the world. And you've kind of followed in his footsteps, really, taken his ideas of doing field research to a new level, haven't you?
yes, and people who came before him, like Sir Richard Burton,
Hmm.
and when I say that, like I said, this idea of Indiana Jones and Star Trek and Star Wars
Right.
going into the unknown has always been a part of me, and a big passion of mine has been doing serious climbing and hiking through unknown places. So
Hmm.
it just all these things came together in a very syncretic fashion. Now, while in the 20th century, they were trying to get hoplology to be accepted as an academic discipline. I don't have that. I don't have that lens. I'm looking at creating a third space.
Hmm.
And what I mean by a third space is you have a practitioner who actually lives this, right? And then you have academics who talk about it,
Hmm.
right? So many times what happens is if you tell them you're doing research, they say, oh, you're not a practitioner.
Mhm.
And then when the academics see you and that you can pull all this off, they're like, oh my God, you're a brute. Right? So I'm like, I'm not interested in that. And this whole politically correct and PC world, and oh, we don't believe in violence
Yeah.
nonsense, right? I gave up on that a while ago, a long time ago. So I'm like interested in creating a third space, and that third space includes the practitioners and from academia, rather than saying, oh, these are the 21 sources, and if it's not published, it's not real. That's bullshit,
Mhm.
right? That's bullshit. So, and how are you going to have sources for your ontology and epistemology? Is there a
Mhm.
source that says this is how Mahipal knows this is the truth, right?
Mhm.
So I think it has more limitations than blessings. However, the one good thing about academia is a very precise method of investigating things, right?
Right.
So from that, take that scientific approach, but not be bogged down by scientism.
Yeah.
Take the academic approach, but not be bogged down by academia.
Now you've gone all over researching this stuff. What are some of the different countries you've visited to do research and some of the more interesting martial arts you found there?
Wow, loaded question. So, I've traveled a fair bit, right? A fair bit. So, over 60 countries. So,
Mhm.
I'm not going to list them out, but let me share some of the more interesting arts. So, I would say number one, I'm kind of making it my mission to open up some of the authentic Indian arts,
Mhm.
predominantly because a process of decolonization of India and the Indian mind has to happen, including the arts. Most of the Indian arts, even to this day, are being defined by Westerners, and they miss the three pieces that drive the arts, which is the ontology, the epistemology, and theology completely. All right. So you can't get it. So that's one piece. Second is, for example, the Maori arts. When you see Maori, you just think of the teha, right? The
Mhm.
stick. There's so much more. I've been working with one of the last, not one of the last, the last warrior priest of the Maoris,
The
and
Maoris are in New Zealand, right?
in New Zealand,
Yeah.
and they have an art called the Rongo Momo, which is the art of wrestling and wrestling without weapons and taking weapons away
Mhm.
from armed fighters. And I don't think anyone outside the core clan had ever seen this art until we convinced them to come over and work with us and start showing the arts in the lab. So that's a
Mhm.
that's a very fascinating art. Some of the Moro fighting arts and how they move, again, shrouded in deep mystery. People talk about the Moros a lot, but hardly anyone has seen how they move the
You're
Kampilan
talking
or the
in southern Philippines generally.
in the southern
Yeah.
Philippines, and those island groups, that island that was to this day being fought over by multiple
Right.
countries, and
And,
you
and
see
most of
this,
the Filipino arts people see in the West are from the central or northern Philippines.
yeah,
Very, very
Cebuano
little.
yes, or
Yeah.
Manila,
Yeah.
correct.
Very little southern Filipino martial arts you actually see in the West.
Yeah, and then various African traditions
Hmm.
and gypsy knives, and so
Hmm.
there's a whole, and the American Bowie knife and the American Bowie knife culture,
Hmm.
much closer to home. I mean, think about it. We are a culture that loves weapons.
Hmm.
You could own a weapon. I mean, you can still own a damn cannon to this day. Nobody banned a cannon, but the only weapon that was banned in the United States was the Bowie knife, and it was banned for a long, long, long time. And there's a reason for that. 70% of the time when a buoy was drawn, one or both people would die.
Hmm.
Okay, and there's a deep tradition within the buoy and the buoy culture, and its roots back to the old world in both Spain and France, and how that particular blade developed. So
Hmm.
some of the more interesting arts are these pieces, and I don't even like using the word art because it kind of starts getting mushy, right? But old fighting methods,
Hmm.
and many of them have not been cataloged and systemized. And when they get cataloged and systemized, where it moves from instinctive response to
Now,
this is how we do it, and that's the end of the combat.
mhm.
And for you to have instinctive response, I'll go back to my old point, right? For you to have instinctive response, ontology, epistemology, and theology drives it, whether you like it or not.
Mm. Now, a lot of these arts, the traditional arts that that you hear about, but you don't see a lot of, often, from what I have seen or heard of them, they're recreations. They're not always, a traditional art that has a legitimate lineage where somebody was taught by somebody who was taught by somebody who was taught by somebody. They're people who have recreated these things and sometimes try to pass them off as traditional ancient arts. How do you determine the people that you're looking at? Is this really something that's a traditional art versus a recreation?
Oh man, I'm going to begin to sound like a broken record. Do they understand theology, ontology, and epistemology?
Hmm.
If they don't, they won't move that way,
Hmm.
right? So, for example, within a lot of HEMA, right, the historical European martial arts,
Hmm.
if you look at from the 90s to the early 2000s, right, you saw people mainly go in it from ninjutsu and FMA.
Hmm.
And you're beginning to see this in this historical African martial art movement too. Most of the guys going in it are coming from ninjutsu and FMA traditions. And you begin
Hmm.
to see those kind of movements
Yeah.
just with different weapons. Doesn't feel right,
Yeah.
right? So that becomes the first thing to say, okay, this doesn't seem right,
Hmm.
right? Second is, do you truly grok the culture, especially if you're a path breaker that's saying I'm bringing this particular traditional art out, and you
Hmm.
have the right to bring it out. You have to be tied to the land. You have to be tied to understanding how this is done, right? Third, paperwork is, for me personally, it's BS, predominantly because how do you verify it? Number one. And number two, the paperwork implies that these were cultures that valued paperwork and precise keeping of records generation after generation.
Hmm.
Now, that kind of obsession you find within the Portuguese and the Spaniards and the British and the Japanese, but not necessarily in predominantly oral cultures,
Hmm.
right? So for me, I generally like to see, okay, watch how they move. That tells me a lot,
Hmm.
right? Two, talking to them and seeing, do they understand how that culture moves? A very good example is, let's say you talk to a Western European or a Northern European guy. They see time in a very linear fashion, very
Hmm.
precise. When you say, I'll meet you at 11 o'clock, they're there at 10:59, right?
Hmm.
Now, you go to a culture where time is circular, say India or the Caribbean islands. If they say 11 a.m., you're lucky if they show up the same day. You understand? So their fundamental experience of how they view life, how they view relationships, how they view fighting
Hmm.
is core to what you do. And when you take somebody's experience of time, their experience of meaning, that's what drives the fighting. So
Hmm.
if you don't understand that, then you don't get that particular way of doing things.
Right.
Sun Tzu said you got to know yourself and your enemy. But if you don't know either, then you will lose. And part of this work of trying to figure out what is real, what's not real, and what's a recreation. Nothing wrong with recreation, right? Everyone's created stuff.
Hmm.
Doesn't mean it came out of nowhere. They've had to have a base somewhere, and they're putting this base together in a very particular fashion, right? So I think that there is room for that, and there's enough room. It's a smorgasbord. Everybody can have what they want, but if you're trying to find the roots to the old world, if you're trying to find that very particular way of being and a very particular way of fighting, then you pay attention to, hey, uh, this was a marshland, but you're moving like people in the flatlands.
Hmm.
You already know it's off, right? Or, hey, this was an art from the mountains. but you're moving like somebody who lives by the rivers,
Yeah.
right? So those are quickly the clues looking at the geography where they come from, the religion, looking at access to the weapons that they had or didn't have, fundamentally defines whether what they're doing is historically accurate or not. Everyone likes to say my art is 2,000 years old.
Mhm.
Okay, so your art is newer than you are because you have come from the Neanderthals 1.4 million years. So you from that perspective, you are here success because your ancestors were good at it, but you're
Mhm.
still learning something that's just 2,000 years old.
Yeah.
I generally don't get into those debates because I'm like,
Yeah.
come on, it's just like my daddy is bigger than your daddy. So,
Yeah,
so
I don't know that how ancient something is necessarily confers any sort of legitimacy
correct.
or
Right.
nobility on it. MMA is 30 years old, but it's still, arguably the most effective unarmed fighting method people have come up with. Whereas some of the things that are thousands of years old from a fighting perspective may not be that useful. But then again, from a artistic perspective or developing discipline character, they may be much better, superior to modern things like MMA. Then again, some modern arts may be superior to some of the ancient arts in that. So I don't know that it
Yeah, I
matters
think
how old
it doesn't
something
matter,
is.
and the pull is very different,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What I mean by pull is, again, it comes down to the experience of time. What are
Yeah.
you valuing? If you
Yeah.
look at MMA, they're valuing what is the best thing in the future.
Yeah.
What will keep me safe there.
Yeah.
Whereas the traditional arts is, hey, our golden period was 14th century feudal Japan. We want
Yeah.
to keep that way alive.
Yeah.
I'm going to wear a hakama and carry my two swords, no matter how ridiculous I look in today's society. And
Yeah.
cool. No, no, I mean, I love Japanese arts. I'm just picking on them at the moment, right? So I think it's your pull. Where's the center of your psyche when what's
Mhm.
pulling you? And
Yeah.
it doesn't make one inferior or superior, just like you said, but I think it comes down to your definition of who you are and what
I
you
I
value.
think they all have a legitimacy. The only thing that bothers me about any of the recreations or so-called ancient arts is when people try
Fake
to
history.
pass off something as ancient when they made it up yesterday.
Yeah,
That
that's
that that
I agree
hypocrisy
with you.
bothers me. Yeah.
No, it bothers me no end, and
Yeah.
that's why what I do. I mean, you've seen portions of my work, and I meet
Yeah.
with a lot of people, and I do, I do serious work, and so I meet my fair share of let's just say recreated history, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I've learned how to sniff it out. And but then again, that came from experience, and the
Right.
experience came from having wool pulled over my eyes a few times too many, you know.
That's,
So
I
I
think
think
that's true of all of us when we get started. Your sensei tells you something, and oh, it's my sensei. It must be true.
yes, yes. So but ultimately, I think the body and the psyche doesn't lie.
Yeah.
And when you learn something like looking at the somatic history, the movement of the body and the history of that movement, and you start to pay attention to um, the pull of the psyche, right? Very, very hard to fake that.
Yeah. Now, yeah, talking about some of the work of yours that I've seen that I really like, you put together a, massive book on stick fighting around the world, how it's
Yeah.
done. I guess you could say stick fighting along with any kind of wrestling or the two fighting methods that virtually every culture on Earth seems to have developed at some point.
Yes.
How did your book on stick fighting come about?
Well, a lot of people, oh, this is a stick fighting art of this particular island, or this is a stick fighting art, and these people here, this is this is that. And
Hmm.
it's like, okay, it's not special. Most cultures have had stick fighting, like you said, like just like wrestling, right?
Hmm.
Uh, so I said, okay, let's see how we tie them. What are the commonalities, and why hasn't anyone done a global survey of these fighting arts from around the world? So
Uh, w
that's how that 5 year project began. I started going to all the people and saying, hey, we want to build this. contribute about your art, contribute about
Mhm.
the history of your place and how these weapon arts came into
What
being.
were some of the main commonalities you found between all these different stick fighting arts around the world?
That it's fundamentally simple.
Hmm.
Make sure that the tip of your stick hits the opponent,
Hmm.
right? Two, you want to always put the stick between you and your opponent, and you hide behind the tree, right?
Yeah.
Third, the length of the weapon and the geography
Hmm.
dictated how you moved, right?
Hmm.
And then after that, everything else was adaptation. If you grew up in and around bamboos, you used bamboos, and that
Hmm.
moved differently than you grew up in southern India and you had access to wood like Nilgiris and Agam, and these were hard, heavy woods.
Hmm.
And then the weight of the wood dictated where and how you moved,
Yeah.
right? So, but at the end of the day, I didn't find anyone who said, "Oh yeah, I put the stick on the ground and all I do is I kick them and I fly." Okay, monkey kung fu different, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
Everyone said tip of the weapon, get get to the head, get to the
Yeah,
shoulders.
people tend to overcomplicate a lot of this stuff, and I think a lot of it is probably from a commercial perspective. Because
Correct.
if you just teach somebody, crack them over the head with a stick, that's one lesson, and you can't keep them coming back to your school to charge them.
I mean,
So
it's a rice bowl strategy, as I call it, you know.
yeah,
The more esoteric I make it, and the more 64 angles of attack that I teach you, then
yeah.
oh, at least I have 64 lessons. Yeah.
So also now you do these things called immersion labs. Can you explain a little bit about what those are and how those came about?
Well, just one of those things, you know. Uh, part of it was my part of it was to find commonality across the arts and say, okay, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, and can we start looking at hopology and the study of arts in a very global fashion? So that was piece A. Part B was I started to archive a lot of the old arts, and one of my teachers, I was trying to convince him to save these old arts, and he's like, "Oh yeah, our art only grew up in relationships." I said, "What do you mean?" He said it grew up in fighting with other arts, and for us to be able to do this, for us to be able to truly save this art of mine, you got to go record all the other arts that we fought against. Otherwise, you don't get it. And he
Mhm.
said that to get rid of me, so to speak. But I didn't understand that. And I went ahead and started recording and archiving those arts. And then he didn't have a way out. And then I said, okay, now if we are going to look at these relationships, then let's look at these ideas. For example, how do knives from around the world move? How do sticks from around the world move? How do the arts of the islands work? You know,
Mhm.
what did the Spanish blade do, and how did it influence the world? Right,
Mhm.
relationships. Right. We started looking at the idea of speed. You know, how different cultures develop speed in different ways, whether it's initiation speed in fencing, to trapping speed and say Wing Chun, to throwing speed and say BJJ and Kushti. You know,
Mhm.
start looking at it much more holistically and say, okay, uh, this is the essence of these arts, and even when we use the words such as speed or throwing or this or that, based on where you come from and what is true for you, you're going to interpret it differently. It doesn't mean that it's completely foreign. It's just that this particular culture or this particular group of people decided to focus on this. But let's look at the things that bring them together more than separate them. The differentiation is great, but if you truly want to understand combat, you got to also understand the combative commonality. So
Yeah,
that was the genesis of this experiment.
I think when people start fighting each other, for real, not talking about point fighting or some type of controlled fighting, but when it's an all-out thing, people start to look very similar to each other because they adapt and certain things work better than others, and if you want to win the fight you're going to do what works best, and
Yes.
people from all styles I think start to gravitate towards those things that work best and start to look like each other. The exception I guess would be if across different cultures that are using very different weapons or very different rule sets in sporting combat, then you'll see differences. But if you just throw two people together in a fight and have them fight perpetually, eventually they're going to be doing the same thing.
And it makes sense, because it
Yeah.
it comes down to just two things: the degrees of freedom of movement you have and
Mhm.
efficiency,
Mhm. So
right?
these immersion labs you do, you're bringing together the people from different aspects of a similar concept. Like you've got one coming up, I think, about on street fighting. What's it called?
Yeah,
Bikers, brawlers,
bikers,
and
brawlers, and
badasses.
badasses.
And you're
Yeah.
bringing together people with actual street fighting experience from a wide
No,
range of different.
so I would just define it a little more broadly. I'm looking at people who actually fought for keeps, right?
Mhm.
That's what I mean by bikers, brawlers, and badasses.
Right.
So everything from old battlefield methods to assassins,
Hmm.
to guys, cops whose job it is to keep violent criminals behind bars,
Hmm.
to criminals and how they
Right.
survive within the prison, and bikers and their visits to the bars. So there's a degree of reality there that would make most martial artists blush,
Right.
and in fact not even want to have a brush with it.
Yeah.
But if you are truly interested in combat and combative behavior, you also got to look at the fringes of our society,
Yeah.
because the fringes are the pioneers, and they overcome challenges that we can't even fathom.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we think of now is the virtuous traditional martial arts got started by those people on the fringes, guys who were thugs or common
Correct.
soldiers out killing people on a
Yeah.
battlefield. And it was only later on that a lot of the traditional or artistic aspects got added on to that, I think.
Yes. So yeah, so this particular experiment with this lab is all about, hey, let's look at the reality of these things where it's not points, it's not a belt, but
Hmm.
this is for the keeps. And what happens, like
Right.
we've got a guy who is in upstate New York prison system for 25 years,
Hmm.
and he survived more than a handful of fights and stabbings.
Right.
He's going to have a very particular view of uh, what fighting is. And then we have on the opposing end somebody like Rory Miller, the
Hmm.
prolific author of Meditations and Violence and other
Hmm.
things, him talking about, hey, what do cops do to stay safe?
Yeah. And you're going to have several people like that, each teaching a block of their
Yeah, so
specialty.
so again, there's a reason it's called immersion, because over 3 days you immerse yourself in that world. And when I say 3 days,
Hmm.
we're talking about 40 hours of mat time,
Hmm.
right? And each teacher has 3 hours to teach their segment, and all teachers participate in everybody else's sessions.
Hmm.
So when you're in that kind of a world, and no social media, no taking pictures, no videos, you're just doing this shit. For 40 hours. It kind of breaks through it. It causes what I call a crack in the cosmic egg,
Hmm.
and something seeps in and something seeps
Hmm.
out. And that is a rare phenomena in this age where clickbait and short
Yeah.
videos define the world.
Yeah.
This is old school method to say, hey, this is why it's an immersion lab.
Yeah.
Immersion because you're going to immerse yourself 40 hours in this madness, and a lab because this is where you experiment to see, does my shit work? Does this
Yeah.
make sense? Is this applicable to me or not? And there's no judgment. There's no, oh, my way or the highway. There's no bells. There's no ranks. And,
Yeah.
we tell everyone when you enter the door, you leave your ego, you leave your BS and your politics at the door. And when you leave, we'll
Mhm.
return it with interest.
So where and when are you holding this, and how can people find out about participating?
So to participate in all the details, go to www.theimmersionlabs.com. There's an
Mhm.
application process. You fill out the form. We'll set up an interview. We'll make sure we both like each other and we can tolerate each other for 40 hours, right? Because at the end of the day, you don't like me and I take your money. You're not going to be happy. I'm not going to be happy. And everyone else around us will be miserable. So we just make sure that it's a good fit for you and us,
Hmm.
right? And if it's a good fit, then we welcome you as a brother or a sister. If it's not,
Yeah.
no problem, man. There's plenty of guys around, right?
Yeah.
Second, it's going to be held in the heart of the Silicon Valley, Bay Area. We
Hmm.
don't reveal the location, but you're within minutes of San Jose and San Francisco airports. All right.
Hmm.
And partly because of the characters that get involved sometimes in these labs. And we don't let any visitors in or out. Once you get in, the doors are closed, and that's that.
Yeah, it certainly sounds fascinating, and I know you do a lot of interesting work. You've done these in the past, and all your stuff that I've seen is very interesting and thought-provoking. What other projects do you have in mind for the future?
I'm working on the next three labs, right? And we'll
Hmm.
talk about that once this is done.
Hmm.
Working on a couple of different interesting aspects of fight training and what that means. We just finished a translation of an old Spanish gypsy knife fighting manual, and we're tying that to some of the Romani methods in Italy, to how the gypsy knives came out of Northwest India, the transformations of it that happened in the Middle East with the Bedouin, and then finding its way into the West,
Mm.
and then some of these Navaja methods, how they ended up on the Americana, on the American coast, and what happened to it. So looking at that, and there's arts change, arts evolve based on where they go. So that's one of the more interesting projects that I'm doing. Then there's another project that I call War Magic. This is all the uh, soft arts, if you will,
Mm.
the arts of the psyche, the arts of religion, the arts of propaganda, the arts of messing with the opponent's psyche, um, that are involved in from the process of making an enemy, defining an enemy, and then overcoming an enemy. So those are some of the more public aspects of things that I'm doing. And then also been working on saving some of the methods of the OODA loop with some of the original students of John Boyd, and what that means, and
Hmm.
what do those insights from fighter plane fighting, how do they translate into modern day combatives?
Yeah,
Because
I know a lot of people have tried to do that, particularly in the firearms community. Often
correct.
it seems to be misunderstood. For people who don't know the OODA loop, can you explain that a little bit?
It's basically it's not even a process. It's because when you say process, people think sequential, but observe, orient, decide, and act.
Yeah,
But these are parallel processing that happens, and it is a way to explain that what happens when input comes in,
yeah,
and how decisions are made for a response to happen. And the goal being that I want to move towards instinctive response, but instinctive response happens based on the kind of training you've done.
hmm,
Now, for you to understand the observe and orient, you have to understand the neurophysiology and neuropsychology of what's happening in the head and how the senses bring information in. So yes, I can throw that OODA loop word out, but if I haven't studied,
yeah,
what does it mean for me to look at that information? How do my
yeah.
perceptual filters and my cognitive biases come in and shape it?
Yeah,
It's
I know in the
BS.
self-defense world, it's almost like a meme. You see people refer to the OODA loop, and I don't
Yeah,
know if too many of them actually know what it means. But
no.
anyway, thank you for doing this. What's the best way for people to find out more about what you've got going on or to contact you?
Yeah,
Immersion
theimmersionlabs.com,
Lab?
and yeah,
We
theimmersionlabs.com, and also on Facebook. It's probably the easiest way to reach me.
Okay, we will put links to those down in the show notes. Again, I want to thank you for being on here. I recommend people check out your work because it really is some of the more interesting and exciting work if you're interested in legitimate martial arts history or more than martial arts as more than just fighting, but as a cultural phenomenon. So thank you again for being on the show, Mahapal. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. We'll chat soon. All right.
Okay, take care.
Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you again to our guest, Mahipal Lunia, for being on the show, as well as Eleanor Academia for providing the music to the show. You can find links to both of their websites down in the show notes. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode. Until then, keep punching.